And I wanted to thank BRAC, Frugal Innovation Forum, for inviting me and my colleague Tanya to be here and for organizing such a fantastic event. But anyway, moving on to today's panel. So we're moderating a panel on PPPs in education, public-private partnerships, and lessons from the region and beyond. As you all know, the governments across the world have partnered with the non-state sector, that's both private and not-for-profit organizations, over time, and in many different and valuable ways. And this we've seen across healthcare, education, technology, and infrastructure. Today we're going to look at one specific aspect, which is public-private partnerships in education, and some of the lessons that have been emerging from the last few years. I expect sort of a lively discussion, because this morning when we were chatting over breakfast, we couldn't agree amongst us on a really clear definition of what public-private partnerships actually means. So I'm hoping to kind of bring that conversation to this panel, as well as open it up to the audience after our panelists present. But for the purposes of getting the conversational ball rolling, let me share one sort of fairly well understood definition of public-private partnerships. So PPPs are a contractual arrangement between public and private actors to jointly develop products and services for the use of the general public. In this, they jointly share the costs and resources, as well as the risks that are connected with these products and services. With that in mind, let me introduce my esteemed panelists. On my extreme left, I have Lee Crawfurd. He's the head of research and evaluation at ARC Education Partnerships Group. ARC EPG supports governments and non-state actors to improve education systems and strengthen accountability systems as well, alongside which they generate rigorous research on the impact of these reforms on student learning. Next to him is Shweta Anand Arora, who's the director of the Education Alliance in India. TEA works alongside governments and non-state actors to run quality government schools. Prior to this, Shweta led content development at Exceed, which many of you heard about earlier today, and prior to that, she was at BCG. Finally, right next to me is Afzal Sarwar, and he's a policy specialist in the Access to Information program of the Prime Minister's Office in Bangladesh. At A2I, Sarwar is responsible for developing an innovative ecosystem for education using ICTs, policy formulation, and the upscaling of innovative ideas in education. Just to give you an overview of the structure today, Lee's going to give us an overview of the PPP landscape, after which I will request the other two panelists to share their remarks and respond to Lee's presentation. We'll spend some time asking the panelists some questions before we open it up to the group. So without further ado, let me turn over to Lee. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around to the end of the day, and it's been a really long but really exciting day. So I'm gonna try and keep this brief and give you a quick overview of what we've learned at ARC EPG from our programs and the evidence that we've reviewed. That's better. So we've just commissioned last year a rigorous review of the evidence on public-private partnerships in developing countries, which I've managed to lug a couple of copies with if anyone would like one. So I'm going to be talking about, this question, what we've learned. Does this work? So who are ARC EPG? So ARC is a UK charity which runs a network of around 30 high-performing academy schools in the UK. So these are government-financed schools, they're free to students, they're targeted in poor areas, disadvantaged children, but they're managed by this non-profit charity ARC. And our international team is the Education Partnerships Group, and we've really, based on the expertise that ARC has built up from the UK, we've been advising governments over the last few years about how they should think about trying to establish similar programs. So how do you best run if you're thinking about starting a public-private partnership in education, what can we tell you from what we've learned in the UK, and how should you think about designing an effective program? And this is some of the engagements we have ongoing for the moment, a pilot in Liberia, 200 schools, talked by a lot of press, a pilot in South Africa, modeled closely on the UK academy model, new pilot starting in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, and in Uganda we've been advising the government on their PPP that's been running for a few years now. And then alongside this, we also advise governments on complementary accountability measures. So we don't think you should just pump money into private schools and let them do their own thing. We think if you're going to be doing this kind of model, you need to pay attention to government oversight and regulation. So we've been working with the government of Madhya Pradesh on their quality assurance program.
So this is perhaps our best known engagement so far, is the study in Liberia, which got a lot of headlines around the world from the international press, and really highlights what a controversial area this is. So there's lots of outraged actors in the sector thinking that it's terrible that we're outsourcing government schools to evil, profiteering private schools. And we really don't think that's the case, but this gives a little flavor of why we think evidence is so important in this sector and why we pushed really hard to get a randomized control trial to really gather rigorous evidence about how effective this program was, and why we went out and commissioned this broader review of the evidence from projects around the world, so we can try and back up the advice we're giving based on the best evidence. To give a bit more of a flavor of different programs around the world, I'm not expecting you to read all of this, but this gives a selection of some of the big programs around the world, some of the programs that we work on. And a couple of things to take away from this table is that the Liberia program is there in the far left-hand side, and it covered 93 schools in the first year, 200 schools in the second year. So whilst we think it's a really exciting pilot, it's relatively small compared to the voucher program in the Philippines, which covers 6,000 schools and which doesn't make so many headlines in The Economist, or the India's Right to Education Act, which covers thousands of schools, millions of children, doesn't make so many headlines in the international press. And then the other thing to take away from this table is that there's this whole range of different kind of policies which we lump together as public-private partnerships, going from, on the left-hand side, fairly public programs where the schools are publicly owned, the teachers are public teachers on public salaries, they're unionized, these schools are free, they're non-selective, they're government schools being run by a non-state actor, right through to the other extreme, which is more private. So the Uganda program, these are fully private schools which just receive a government subsidy from government, and there's very light touch regulation there. There's very few restrictions on what they can and can't do. They just get some public financing. So perhaps I should have started with this. What do we mean by PPP? So we may have some disagreement with this on the panel later, but the way we think about PPPs is this 2x2 matrix showing the financing and provision of schools, and whether that's the public or the private sector. And you can think about the traditional public school system being in the top left, publicly financed and publicly provided, or a purely private system you can imagine. And then this area in the top right is what we're interested in, where it's public financing and into private schools. And within that, we think about these two different models. So contracting out public schools to a private provider that remains a public school, or providing a voucher or a subsidy for a student to attend a private school, but both within that area. And so we commissioned this rigorous review. The most recent review before this was in a World Bank study in 2009. It's been nearly a decade, and there's been a lot more evidence since then, so we thought we'd refresh that. And seeking to answer these two questions. So what is the impact of public-private partnerships for education on learning outcomes for children? And in particular, how are the children from the lowest socioeconomic quintiles doing? And how do these policies work for those children? So we went through this process, which is a fairly standard now systematic review process of screening studies to focus on the high quality studies, which can tell you something about the causal impact of these policies. We started with 2,000 studies and whittled them down to a grand total of just 22 studies that met the quality standards that were looking at these programs. A lot of them from Chile and Pakistan and Uganda. But it's a pretty small number of studies covering well over 100 low and middle income countries. And so what do we find? So this is an update of the 22 studies with an additional 3 or 4 studies that have come out since we finished the review. And so broadly, the picture looks pretty positive. There are no negative results from any of these studies. There's roughly half showing clear positive impacts on learning outcomes, and half more mixed results with some positives and some negatives. So to pick out a few highlights, the Liberia study is new in the contract schools. I put it in the mixed column. I mean, it did get really strong impacts on learning, but the project did cost quite a lot of money. So in terms of cost effectiveness, there's a debate to be had there. But it's still an initial first-year pilot of the program that we expect to keep improving and at lower cost as it goes. The second, in India, the subsidy program is there's the first study on the Right to Education Act, which found relatively marginal gains for children who are attending private schools through that program. And then broadly, the strongest evidence was found for I'd say the contract schools and the subsidy schools, with weaker evidence for voucher programs. And so to dig into that a little bit more, overall, kind of a mixed and limited evidence base. It's a small number of studies, most of them showing generally positive outcomes, but with some mixture there. So we think there's certainly still enough evidence for us to keep going and to keep working on these programs, but we want to keep generating evidence as we go. We think that's really important. So in terms of the contract school programs, this is really looking at just 3 programs, some of which are quite small. So the Columbia program covering 25 schools, which had quite good results, but it's 25 schools. The PSL program, which is a small number of schools, but found really strong evidence. And then the Pakistan program, which is a bit bigger. Lots of interesting things happening in Pakistan. And the key takeaway from this section for us was that we're going to continue working in this area. We're working on these experiments in South Africa, Ghana, Liberia, Ivory Coast. And all of these studies we think need to be rigorously evaluated to test if they're really working as we continue to experiment. In terms of vouchers, the evidence was more mixed. This is partly driven by a lot of this research being from Chile, which had quite a controversial experience with vouchers, and a lot of the research showing that there's a risk that these vouchers will be taken up by the highest income children, and really driving some inequality there. Interestingly, the more recent studies, Chile's had some years of experience now, and they've started to bring in more government regulation to that program, and it seems to be improving. And so, yeah, the takeaways from here, so we think people should be trying voucher experiments if you want to do them with better accountability mechanisms in place for the schools that are going to be benefiting from this. And to evaluate, so again, the Philippines voucher program is huge. It's like 1 million children. I haven't seen any rigorous research on or much attention to. In terms of subsidies, again, kind of a mixed bag, mostly positive evidence. And the takeaways from this body of studies was this kind of PPP may be slightly less controversial because it's schools that already exist and it's just giving them a top-up, and it's been used in a number of places to increase access as well as learning. So the Uganda study that I worked on, really the government just wanted to introduce universal secondary education, didn't have the schools, kind of had to rely on the private sector if they wanted to achieve their goals of increasing access. And the program has done that very well. And we're working with the government now on thinking about the next steps for how to improve the policy. And India's right to education, clause 12, just is a huge, huge program that's, we think, really massively under-researched still. So in terms of the successful features of the PPP, so we've learned that generally these policies seem to be quite promising, but really what we want to know is what features of these policies matter most. What does a good policy look like, and what does a bad policy look like? And sadly, for me as a researcher, I don't think we have quite high quality enough evidence to be able to make really strong statements about this yet, based on the evidence. And so it's helpful to fall back on first principles of public management and the theory of what works. And really the the ideas behind, in particular, the contract school model, the charter schools or academies, is about providing accountability and autonomy for schools. So it's a deal where schools get more autonomy, but they're held accountable for outcomes. And so the principles of this is that the center should be setting standards, what's expected, it should be monitoring performance, and then there should be clear consequences based on that performance. So if schools are continuing to underperform, then something needs to change, or they'll just continue to do that. But as part of the deal, schools then get this great deal of autonomy over how they run the school. So who they hire, how they train them, how they teach, that's up to the school. All they have to do is reach for outcomes in terms of learning that the government wants them to achieve. And the lesson on the voucher side and the subsidy side is, again, you want to have some kind of government oversight over quality, but also it really matters here what you're comparing to. So we're always comparing to a government school. So the literature from America shows that charter schools do better than government schools in the cities, where the government schools are really poor. But where the government schools are much better in the suburbs, it's much harder to do better. So it's kind of natural that you have to think about what your alternatives are and what the next best alternative is. If you have a great public school, then it's going to be really hard for a PPP school to outperform it. And so what does all this mean for Bangladesh? I'm going to focus here on lessons for government and for funders, which is where our primary focus is. But that's not to say there's not something that other school operators and non-state actors could take away from this evidence. So we've come across several experiences where schools have been able to approach governments and demonstrate their effectiveness and to make the case for receiving public financing. So we now have 3 schools in Delhi that are receiving public financing. The Peas network in Uganda have persuaded the government in Zambia to start financing their schools there. So if a non-state school operator such as BRAC, I think has a really compelling model, then why not go and knock on the government's door and start, asking for some public financing? Like, you're providing a public service to students at no or low cost, then there perhaps should be some government financing there. But the lessons for governments is really, I'm a researcher saying we need more research, which is what we always do, but we really do think there's evidence base is really thin here. We think governments should be trying to build competitive markets between schools rather than necessarily picking winners and just saying, in contradiction of what I just said about supporting BRAC maybe, governments should be trying to produce a healthy ecosystem of schools. And then reminding people that the public part of a public-private partnership is really important. It's not just about the private sector. You need to have the capacity of the government to monitor and to regulate these schools for it to be effective. And that process matters. So like any public procurement, you want a clear, fair, transparent, competitive bidding process for operators to demonstrate that they're going to produce a good outcome. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you so much, Lee. I'd be really curious to reflect on your understandings of public-private partnerships, given your experience in the space, and if you have any specific responses to Lee's presentation. Sarwar, why don't we start with you? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Honorable Moderator. This is my privilege to be here with all of you, and thank you, the organizer, for inviting me. Actually, thank you, Lee, for your nice presentation, and I fully agree with the last slide that you have mentioned about focus on particular areas on research and competitive market and the procurement process and so on. I fully agree with you that in particular in Bangladesh, we are very poor in research, and we don't do much research in any particular area when we're saying that we are building our students and for the 21st century environment or the world, but we're not doing sufficient research in this area. And with this, I want to share some lessons in our country, but I'm sure that these lessons will not fully agree with the definition you have said in the beginning. Because in the journey of education, we're working with many partners, and we have worked already, like some development partners, private entrepreneurs, individuals as well, in the NGOs and INGOs, including BRAC, Save the Children, and many more. So from our journey, we have learned something, and that I want to share with all of you. The first story, I will share 3 stories, and the first story about technology as a tool for quality education, and this story how the private partner and telco partner was involving with us and what we have learned that I am going to share with you. This is about the technology in classroom, and you know this is multimedia classroom, and using multimedia in classroom, this is nothing new in the world. But in Bangladesh, we have innovated in a different way. Many countries, you know that the content can be developed by the third-party organization. But in Bangladesh, our teachers are developing contents who have got training from the e-learning expert and the teacher educator. They are producing content. And this is the environment about the multimedia classroom, where students are learning in an environment that is focusing on 21st century skills. They are getting chance to practice and exercise. And it is also helping to improve the teaching quality. Actually, the purpose of the using technology in classroom was the integrating pedagogy with ICTs. That was the main focus. And we have also focused on to reduce digital and education divide, because you know that we are sending ICT equipments in the urban areas, urban schools, but this is the first time initiative from the government, that government has undertaken the initiative to develop multimedia classroom throughout the country. And this innovative initiative, actually we have started with a telco partner and with Ministry of Education, and it was actually incubated in 400 schools, 400 multimedia classrooms. And when we got the positive results, then ministry was convinced, and they have undertaken a project about $40 million. And from that project, now more than 38,000 multimedia classrooms are functioning throughout the country. The next story about empowering teachers, because it has been already discussed that teachers are the key factor for the classroom, and they are the change agent and change maker in the classroom to create an interactive environment for the students and to ease the teaching learning process. That's why we have focused on our teachers, and as I mentioned that we have trained our teachers to developing digital contents for their own classroom, and now they are empowered and they are developing content, they are sharing with each other. Actually, this story about 23 teachers who told us that your approach to inject technology in classroom will not be sustainable in the long run. Then we asked them, which will be the sustainable model? Then they told us to develop a social media platform where they want to share their own developed content and teach to other teachers and learn from the other teachers. That's why actually the born of the teachers portal, and this is the award-winning platform, Voices award-winning platform of 2014. And we started with the 23 teachers, and now the number is 260,000, and more than 260,000 are teachers interacting with each other. They're learning from each other, and they are sharing their content. Now the content is more than 120,000. And with whom? This innovative initiative was also started with British Council at the beginning, And now we have got many partners, including Ministry of Education, MOPME, and they are scaling up throughout the country. And with this content development process, now you know that, probably you know, our National Curriculum Textbook Board, they are also developing interactive digital textbook materials, where BRAC already has been contributed, and with ICT division, Save the Children has developed many content for the primary level. And the beauty of the platform, that there is a built-in gamification process where each week this system selects 3 best contributor teachers. And here you are seeing one of the best teachers, and this process actually set a competition within the teachers to develop best and effective content for them. And the third story is about the extensive that we have also learned, that extensive partnerships creating multiplier effect. Through A2I Service Innovation Fund, we have created a platform where we are inviting the public, private, and individuals, private organization and individuals, to come up with their innovative ideas, innovative proposals, so that we can incubate it and we can promote it and we can upscale it. And through this Service Innovation Fund, SIF attracted more than 3,000 innovative proposals, and more than 130 innovative projects are being upscaled with public and private organizations and with individual level. And here, public, private development organizations, NGOs, academic institutions, and individuals are contributing. And this, from this initiative, we have got the DAISY standard multimedia talking boot. Actually, we haven't thought about that, but one private organization came up with this solution. And the next picture is about the Frugal Innovation, the low-cost 3D printers that actually develop the education materials as well as artificial limbs. And this student, for the first time, she holds something with her own hand using this 3D printers developed artificial limbs. And I will be, from the journey of the learning, we have actually learned this lesson, that if we work with our partners, then we have to have the shared vision, and we have to encourage the innovations, and we have to ensure the enabling environment, and there must be a sustainable strategy to innovate together, incubate together, and upscale together. And I'll be stopping here with this African proverb, that if you want to go fast, then go alone. But if you want to go far, then go together. But from our innovative journey of partnership, we have learned that with the new slogan, if you want to go far and fast, then innovate together, work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarwar, for that really interesting presentation on the innovation and upscaling within the Access to Information program. Shweta, can I please invite you as well to make your remarks and respond to Lee's presentation? Thanks.
Thanks, Aashti. And thank you for sharing your experiences. So before I comment on what my colleagues have shared, I'm just going to share a little bit about the context of the work that we are doing in India. So we started about 3 years ago, and what we are seeing in our country is that the public at large is fairly disappointed with the quality in the government school system, and is leaving en masse to go to low-cost private schools. And as a result, what we have is a lot of infrastructure that's lying underutilized. We have more than 300,000 schools across the country that have less than 50 children. And these are schools that are, have great infrastructure, have teachers, have everything that it requires, but there are no children. And on the other hand, we have a large low-cost private school sector, which has very variable quality and is not regulated in terms of outcomes. So our attempt was, can we sort of leverage the strengths of both sectors to create sort of a third alternative for children from disadvantaged families, where there is quality and there is access as well. So we started a small pilot with the South Delhi municipality, where we started with just one school, and now it's grown to 30 schools. And the way it works is that the government provides the land and the building. So we actually fall under the contract management category that Lee spoke about. And the teachers also come from the government side. And the non-profit provider brings in sort of the academic management expertise. They bring in the academic leadership, the curriculum, the teaching learning materials, and they take on accountability for dramatically improving quality in the school. So they have, they commit to KPIs which include enrollment, attendance, and learning outcome increases. And what we found, I mean, it's been a very challenging journey, and I think one of the big sort of learnings has been the need to focus on sustainability. And I'll just come to that. But before I come to the challenges, let me talk a little bit about the successes. So what we've seen is, you know, in a brief amount of time of 2 years, we've seen dramatic increases in enrollment. So year on year, there's been 75% increase in enrollment across these schools. The attendance is now at about 75%, which is similar to the official government statistic, but when we go in practice, we don't see a 75% attendance in government schools. And when we look at learning outcomes, we've just had our first year of data come in, and we're seeing tremendous gains. We're seeing, you know, 2 to 3 times as much learning happening as what happens in a typical school without intervention. But yes, coming to the challenges, I think you know, it's important to create a model where it's a true partnership between government and the private or the non-profit partners. And I think that is the big challenge. So currently, while the government does contribute a huge amount in terms of the land, building, and their teachers, I think if we have to scale this, there still has to be further sort of conversation around sustainability. And what we've seen is an interest from the government to engage in that conversation now, and to find ways of making this partnership more effective, more efficient, so that we're making sort of the best use of resources from you know, both the partners' sides. We've also seen a policy that's come up in Rajasthan where you know, they talk about, which is modeled on the typical charter school system where government also provides financing and has the option that is similar to our model where you use government teachers and resources. So there are sort of multiple experiments happening across India, and I think we are very early in this journey, but there are lots of lessons learned, and I'd be happy to share more as we sort of jump into the questions.
Thanks so much, Shweta. Let's turn to just kind of a more general discussion before we open it up to the audience for the Q&A. I guess my first question really is, given all three of your experience in the space and the countries that you've worked in, how do you define a public-private partnership in education? What are the essential elements that make something a public-private partnership versus just a partnership, I guess?
Okay, thank you again. As you know, A2I is a policy project at the Prime Minister's office, and we need to work with almost every ministry's division and directorate for many different initiatives, because we are working in the health sector, agriculture sector, education sector, and any other sector as well. Because the motto of A2I is service as at people's doorstep. The main focus is to creating e-services for the citizens. That's why we have created the UDCs in the rural level, union level, And that is the citizens' access point where citizens get services from that UDCs. So in terms of the partnerships, as we have made our own definition of PPP because as I have mentioned that we are working with almost every ministries, division, directorates, even NGOs and private partners as well. So that's why we, many times we need to collaborate, cooperate, and work jointly with the partners. From that point of view, actually, I also told earlier that the definition you have mentioned at the beginning, that is not goes perfectly with our definition. So to us, actually, if I need to work for the education sector, then we found the appropriate authorities, appropriate enabler, and we work with them. To me, actually, if we want to work with them, then at first we need to know about the shared vision about my partner, then the capacity of the partner, that they have actually, that capacity has or has not, and the sustainable strategy, that is very essential. Because probably, I always encourage innovation. So maybe one innovative ideas or innovative initiatives we incubate together, but if there is no sustainability plan or no opportunity for the upscaling, actually it has no future. That's why we think in this way. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful, and I think sustainability has come up throughout the day as kind of a big question for many organizations. I'd be interested, Shweta, in your experience in that regard.
So so like I said, is it working? We've started with a model where we are sort of using government resources, but topping that up with academic leadership and teaching learning materials and all of that. And coming back to your question about the definition, I think you talked about, you read out this definition, and I picked up two sort of key elements of that. I think the fact that it's a contractual arrangement and that the two parties jointly share the costs and the risks. And I think that's how we would like to define PPPs in our context. And there has to be sort of a commitment from both sides to really make this happen, including on, like you said, sustainability. So I think unless the government figures out a way of either reimbursing partners for these top-up expenses or figuring out a model where you don't use government teachers, you just get a similar cost or even a lower cost than what the government spends on their own, it's difficult to create a model that is sustainable, because philanthropy, as we've discussed several times today, is shrinking, and this is a service that you're providing for the government. So I think it's very important to very clearly define what each partner brings and what they are sort of supposed to be held accountable for. The private partner is bringing the innovation, the delivery, the outcomes. I think the sustainability is something that needs to be thought through collaboratively.
Lee?
Yeah, I'd just like to agree with a couple of points that Sarwar made. I mean, clearly, like, public-private partnerships can be more than just the operation of a school. It can be the provision of all sorts of inputs to the process of an existing government school or a private school. So there's clearly a whole range of different models and different kinds of partnerships that you could have. And secondly, I really like the point you made about having a shared vision. I think that's really important. Like, what are these schools really trying to achieve? And I think even within just leaving aside the private sector, just thinking about the government sector, in a lot of countries, there's no shared vision between the school and the ministry and the parents about what the school should really be achieving, like what standards we're expecting students to be able to achieve by the time they leave school. I don't think that's at all clear in a lot of countries. So getting that clear, shared sense of purpose and what this school is trying to achieve has to be like the first step before we can even think about holding people accountable for an outcome if it hasn't been, set in the first place.
That was actually going to be my next question, so it's a brilliant segue. I was going to ask you what is the secret sauce and what do governments need to have in place before they even consider engaging with the non-state sector? When is it appropriate and when is it not the right space to be thinking about a PPP?
Yeah, I think, based on what we've seen, I think there are a few very critical elements that if in place would make for a much sort of stronger environment for a PPP. And some of those are having student assessments, having school assessments, having sort of fair and transparent selection of teachers, having some of the the fundamental building blocks of a strong education system in place, that supports the accountability that you need for a PPP to happen. And I think, without that, PPPs would be set up for failure. So in our case, we've had to actually set up some of these building blocks in addition, again, on top of what already exists, because it doesn't exist in the broader system. But eventually our goal is that, not only to build that for the PPP, but also to build it for the broader system itself. And I think Lee actually referred to it in his presentation. I think at least when we speak of the contract schools, I think those make sense to do if you don't already have a strong public or a strong private system. If you have either of those, then this is not necessarily an alternative that you want to look to. So, we have the RTE 25%, but given that we have such a small cream of schools that are really high quality and the rest is sort of all at a similar sort of level, I think PPPs make for a strong case.
Great. Sarwar, did you have any comments to add to that? And then I think I'll open it up to the group. Should we open it up? Great. I think this is probably the right time to open it up to the audience for any questions that you might have for my esteemed colleagues. Please.
Hi, this is Mohammad Ghulam Kibri, Education Advisor, Defeat Bangladesh. In terms of definition of public-private partnership, I think it's quite contextual in terms of the country context, and as already shared, depends on the shared vision. So in that context, I have a specific question to Lee, is that how do you see the public-private partnership in terms of when people spending a lot of money as a private cost, along with what government is, also providing in terms of school infrastructure, teachers, salary, and all these things, but also parents are also spending money as a private cost. So whether should we call that a public-private partnership, because the vision is shared, it's a shared vision, because we want to get our children a better education. So this is first question. Second question is that in your definition, you said that contract management, it's a contract management. Partnership and contracts, I don't know whether it goes together, because partnership is something different, where it's a shared things, mutual things, where contract is specific thing where you're giving some task and people do that. So I don't know whether it goes in the definition of partnership. So these are my two specific questions. And one information is that in Bangladesh, secondary education, it's a big example of public-private partnership. I don't know, maybe there are not enough evidence and research done, but there may be, we need to think about it, but where more than 90% of secondary schools are managed by private, and government is giving huge subsidies in terms of full teacher salary, textbook, and partial support for infrastructure and other inputs. So that's just for information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful to know that. Lee? Or should we let's take this question and then we can take a couple more.
Actually, this was about the secondary system in Bangladesh. There are more than 20,000 institutions, about 98%. is actually fits a public-private partnership definition. The government is paying teachers' salary and some of the capital cost, and then the schools recover some fees from the students, and they raise additional money, and the schools are managed by a local managing committee of the parents. So, but it has managed to combine all the negative elements of a public system and a private system, corruption, lack of accountability, and all these things. So I think your definition maybe, I don't think it has to fit a very rigid, pattern. It can be varied depending on the context and whether there is a contract. Certainly, if there are a partnership, there has to be some sort of agreement, which you can call a contract. So it doesn't matter. But it can vary. But the point is, the examples that you have given, I think the research evidence is mainly related to sort of financial contribution, sharing the financing. But isn't this Bangladesh example, and maybe others that you have mentioned, point to the fact that it is more a question of the stakeholders coming together and doing a good management, better management, agreeing on common educational goals and realizing those goals, working together for that, all the stakeholders, partners coming together. So that should be the focus. That if that is the focus, then some of the sensitivities about private, public, and so on, I think maybe is not so critical. So I'm just wondering if this is something, I think, what is your view on this, whether you agree? Thank you.
Obviously, fees is a really controversial issue, and you have some people on one side who say that you need, or some financial investment by parents means that they're bought in and they're paying attention and the school is accountable to them because their money is involved. But on the other hand, one of the really attractive possibilities from a PPP is that you're gaining some of the private sector expertise in management, but you're providing access to people who maybe couldn't afford to attend a private school. So there's strong arguments on both sides, and I think I don't think we have clear answers yet. One thing to note, in a lot of places, fees are still there in the government system as well, whether they're explicit tuition fees or whether they're various hidden fees for uniforms or for exams or for various other things. And then the second point on the secondary schools in Bangladesh. So I'm not very familiar with the system here at all, but I know a little bit. In India, they have aided private schools and unaided private schools. And the aided private schools, they get government teachers, and researchers on the spectrum of a PPP, they might just about be on there, but they're kind of closer to a normal government school than they are to a private school, because all of the accountability issues that are missing there in the government sector just get passed over. So I don't know if it's a similar situation here. And your point on the word contract, I thought was a really good one. We really want more of a marriage than a legal contract where everything has been specified. We want everyone to be collaborating. So maybe that's not the best word, and we are still scrabbling around, I think. In some countries, it's collaboration schools, and in some, it's partnership schools. So we're kind of scrabbling around with terminology. But there's something really useful, I think, about specifying in an agreement what's expected of a school, which would be helpful in the government system as well. Like, what is expected of a school? What are you, and how are we going to check if you're achieving that goal or not?
My question is to Mr. Sarwar. I'm just wondering whether you could explain a little more on what exactly does the terminology in your scheme of public-private partnership, what exactly does the terminology 21st century skills mean? Because, it'll be useful to, if you could break that down. Because if it is, and I hope I'm wrong, if it is about introducing computers into the classrooms, then we are only playing catch-up with 20th century skills. But if it is, well, I don't know. So I need to understand from you, if you could, break it down a little more, what exactly is the meaning of 21st century skills? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for raising the very important question. Actually, I fully agree with you that just introduce ICTs in the classroom that will ensure 21st century skills. Not really. Actually, the purpose of multimedia classroom, probably we are talking about that. The purpose of multimedia classroom was integrating ICTs in classroom to make easier teaching learning for the teacher, and for the student, their learning will be easier and effective. That's the purpose. And in terms of 21st century skills practice, we are focusing that when a teacher is showing a picture or a video, then teacher will be asking a student to explore, to think, and to collaborate with the other students. That actually gives the environment of collaboration, co-creation, and decision-making as well, because sometimes they need to work in a group, so there's opportunity to group work, to take decision, and when they will be presenting, there will be opportunity to build up the communication skills as well. So that's why we are thinking that multimedia classroom actually gives a student opportunity to exercise, especially the 4C of 21st century skills. That is critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaborative skills. That was actually the theme. Did you get the answer? Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
My name is Sudrul Mujumdar. I do work for BRAC. So we are talking about public-private partnership, and the issue is quality education. So if we look at the Constitution of Bangladesh, education is my right as a citizen of Bangladesh because it's guaranteed by my constitution. So, and we all know that state itself has actually failed to ensure that my right to education as citizen, and obviously there are spaces which is abandoned to some extent. And if the question of involvement of the private sector comes in, is it for actually complement the government institution and capacity of the public institutions, or it would be actually for the private initiatives, private sectors to grab in that space and make money out of it?
Thank you for that, for raising. I thought we would get through the session without this question. But since you've raised it and it's very relevant, let me ask my panelists if they have any thoughts.
I mean, the idea is not necessarily to make money off government resources. The idea is to provide a high-quality alternative to children, which is free, and do it in a way that is sustainable and that incorporates sort of accountability. So I think those are the necessary elements. The cost that is normally, it's not even paid out right now in India, but what we would advocate to be sort of provided for would be to cover for the resources that you're putting in, and not necessarily to take money out of the system.
And just to add to that, I think, the point I think that some of us feel is that, yes, absolutely, it is a right to have access to quality education, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the government needs to be the provider of that education. They could be the guarantor of that education, they could be the financier of that education, but they don't necessarily need to be delivering that education, particularly in contexts where they do not have the capacity to deliver that education, and that it's quality education that they're delivering. So I think that's what we're trying to do, is kind of expand the notion of who can be delivering that, how you hold those actors accountable to deliver that quality education.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the role as regulator is extremely important, and I think we underestimate that role that the government needs to play, not just for the PPP sector, but also for itself and for the private sector. I think that's something that needs to cut across.
I think we'll take one last question from Urvashi, because you've been...
First of all, thank you. That was really very, very interesting panel. My point, I think, and I want to add my voice to the gentleman at the back, that when you look at some of the developed countries, look at Finland, and many of them, the main provider and deliverer is the government, right? So we pay our taxes. I feel, by the way, doubly charged. I have paid my taxes, and I have paid my children's fees as well. Actually, I wish I had a good public school system where I could. And I think we should be careful not to give the government more fodder for saying, yeah, let's give it to the private. We can't do it. You know, because I'm warning you, and with your research, you saw that. Nobody will reach the poorest of the poor except the government. They have the resources, and they should be doing it. I was thinking that public-private partnerships, of course, they should be. It's a democracy. We are citizens, and private people, we must partner with the government. It's our duty, right? Whether we get paid or not, that's another matter. But the point is that we should be partnering to build the capacity that they don't have. All these countries are young democracies, and we are not all in the 21st century, by the way. Let's just disabuse our minds of that. The globe is not all of it in the 21st century, right? So we must be, first of all, partnering with them in order to build that capacity that is lacking. And I think those are the most successful public-private partnerships, because they are systemically trying to improve the system rather than the school by school by school. Those are, meaning they're unsustainable. They're unsustainable. Right? And I would really like us not to allow the government a chance to cop out. It is their duty, it is my right. So.
Thank you for that. I think that might be the best wrap up. Let's break for the evening.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. I must say, it has been a very long day with so much of intensive discussion covering a wide array of issues on education. We have heard about the leapfrog which we'll be needing to meet the global education challenges. We have seen different assessment models, technological innovations from home and abroad. Together, we all try to find out the gaps that need to be addressed to provide 21st century skills to our students. Also, we made play materials together. We have seen innovative school models, heard about importance of developing the capacity of teachers and administrators with 21st century skills. And finally, we heard how public-private partnership can bring effective results in ensuring quality education. I'd like to thank you for showing your enthusiasm all the day and for your constructive discussion. We know after such a hectic day, you will be needing some fresh air and a nice time. We have arranged live music, and we will also be playing with the clay to give you a touch of the traditional pottery in the evening. I'm inviting all of you to the open deck at 7:30 p.m., where we will be doing all those things together. And by saying that, I, Tanjilut Tasnuba, I'm closing the first day of the 5th Frugal Innovation Forum. Thank you so much.